The invisible engine of life. My dear Evergreen seniors, welcome back to our shared garden of wisdom. Let me begin with a small truth most gardeners overlook. When a plant struggles, slow growth, small fruit, weak stems, we tend to blame what we can see. But the real story is never in the leaves. It is always underground, where a quiet, hidden engine decides everything. Just a few inches beneath your feet lies a living world more powerful than any fertilizer on a store shelf. And here's the part that surprises almost everyone. For about $1, using a simple ingredient already sitting in your kitchen, you can trigger root growth so intense that scientists have recorded biomass increases approaching 30%. Not with chemicals, not with gadgets, but with a biological brew that wakes up an underground workforce your plants have been waiting for. Today, we're stepping into the gentle world of kitchen science, where an ordinary baking staple transforms into a living signal, telling your plants it's time to grow. And while we explore this tiny miracle, we'll also discover something meaningful about our own vitality in our golden years. Because strength, for plants and people alike, always begins in the unseen places. So pour yourself a warm cup of tea, settle in, and let's uncover the invisible engine that could triple your harvest with a single watering. Are you ready? Let's begin. Part 1. The microscopic workers in your cupboard. Now, my dear Evergreen seniors, let's open the door to a world so small, yet so powerful, that it can reshape your entire garden. Inside a single teaspoon of ordinary baker's yeast, yes, the same one you use for bread, live millions of tiny sleeping workers. They look like a simple beige powder, harmless and quiet. But the moment they touch warm water and just a whisper of sugar, everything changes. They wake up, they come alive, and they begin a transformation far more important to your garden than rising dough. As yeast begins to ferment, it consumes the sugar and releases a surge of B-complex vitamins, amino acids, and enzymes into the mixture. These aren't just nutrients floating in water. They are the exact molecules plants need to build new cells, repair damaged tissue, and ignite rapid growth. It's like delivering construction materials already cut, shaped, and ready to use. No extra energy required from the plant.
And here's the surprising part many gardeners never learn. Yeast contains almost every essential mineral a plant searches for its entire life. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, zinc, iron. The very elements that commercial fertilizers try to imitate. But while chemical fertilizers blast plants with raw NPK, yeast works very differently. It doesn't force feed. It reorganizes. It reshapes the meeting point between soil and root, helping your plant absorb what the soil already has, but more efficiently, more gently, and far more sustainably. Yet there is something even more fascinating happening here. Something that borders on a secret language between microbes and plants. As yeast ferments, it produces natural compounds that mimic plant hormones, especially auxins and cytokinins. And these signals act like green traffic lights, telling the plant, go, grow, expand. Auxins whisper to the roots, urging them to branch, split, and send out fresh white tips like fireworks underground. Cytokinins travel upward, making sure the leaves and stems keep pace with the explosion happening below. Together, they create harmony, a full-body growth response that turns an ordinary plant into a vigorous, productive one. And this, my friends, is only the beginning. Because once these microscopic workers enter the soil, something even more dramatic starts to unfold. Something most gardeners have never heard about. But we'll get to that in just a moment. Part 2. Rhizophagy. The thrilling feeding frenzy. Now, my dear Evergreen seniors, prepare yourself for one of the most astonishing discoveries modern plant science has uncovered.
For decades, we believed that roots behaved like drinking straws, quietly sipping dissolved nutrients from the soil. Simple, passive, predictable. But that picture was wrong. Because deep underground, something far more dramatic is happening. Something that feels less like gentle gardening and more like a feeding frenzy. Scientists call it the rhizophagy cycle, and once you understand it, you will never look at your plants the same way again. Imagine the very tips of a plant's roots. They may look soft and fragile, but in truth, they are active hunters. When living microbes, like the yeast from our brew, approach those root tips, the plant doesn't merely absorb nutrients around them. No, it pulls the entire microbe inside the plant's own cells.
And once the yeast enters, the plant unleashes a burst of reactive oxygen. It strips away the yeast's outer walls, carefully harvesting the nutrients and growth compounds hidden inside. It is precise. It is efficient. And it is happening quietly beneath your garden every single day. Yet the story doesn't end there. The microbes that survive this intense extraction are pushed back out through the tips of the root hairs, returned to the soil to recover. And astonishingly, as they exit, they trigger the root to grow even more hairs, creating fresh gateways for the next round of nutrient capture. In other words, the plant and the microbes form a loop, a cycle, a tiny engine of life and energy that fuels itself again and again. This is why a living yeast brew is so powerful. You are not feeding your plants with dead salts that wash away with the next watering. You are delivering millions of living workers, fuel for a biological engine that never stops turning. And once this engine starts running, roots don't just grow, they explode. They branch, they hunt, and your entire garden begins to feel alive. But this underground drama is only half the story. Because in the next part, we'll uncover something even more surprising. Something that transforms weak, sandy soil into a living sponge that holds moisture and nutrients like never before. Let's keep going. Part 3, EPS, the invisible bioglue. Now, my dear EverGreen seniors, let's turn our attention to the ground beneath our feet, especially those of you who garden in sandy, tired soil. You know the struggle well. You water generously, but the water slips away like it has somewhere more important to be. You add nutrients, yet the soil releases them just as quickly. Nothing seems to stay. Nothing seems to hold. But this is exactly where our humble yeast brew begins to shine in a way that feels almost magical. When yeast wakes up and begins its work, it secretes something called extracellular polymeric substances, EPS for short. The name sounds scientific, but the idea is beautifully simple. EPS is nature's own bioglue, a sticky, gentle substance that clings to tiny particles of sand and silt, binding them together into what scientists call aggregates. Imagine the difference between a handful of dry beach sand and a soft crumb of rich garden soil that holds shape when you squeeze it. That transformation, fragile particles becoming stable crumbs, happens because of this invisible glue. And when your soil forms these aggregates, everything changes. The earth becomes a biological sponge. It absorbs water instead of rejecting it. It holds nutrients instead of losing them. It builds tiny pockets of life-safe places where microbes can grow, where roots can explore, and where moisture stays long after the sun has gone down. For your plants, this creates a kind of protective cocoon. Even during heat waves or short droughts, the roots remain cushioned in moisture, supported by a structure that doesn't collapse at the first sign of stress. In lab trials, this living matrix of EPS has been shown to dramatically improve the survival and growth of young seedlings, even in harsh, semi-arid soils where plants usually struggle to stay alive. It is proof of what many gardeners learn only after years in the soil. Sometimes, the difference between thriving and failing isn't strength. It is support. And perhaps that is a lesson for all of us. Through the hard seasons of life, the thing that carries us forward is often not force or perfection, but the gentle structures that hold us together. Our routines, our relationships, our communities, and the quiet resilience we build over time. Just like the soil, we thrive when something beneath us is steady. And thanks to this living bioglue, your garden can finally have that foundation. Let's keep going, because the recipe that brings all of this to life is simpler than you might imagine.
Part 4. The EverGreen recipe. How to do it right. Now that you've met the microscopic workers and the hidden engines beneath your soil, my dear EverGreen seniors, it's time to bring this power into your own backyard. And with living biology, precision is not a burden. It's a kindness. When you respect life, life responds with abundance. So here is the EverGreen Senior's treasured recipe, the one many gardeners overlook, yet the one that can awaken a root system almost overnight. Begin with 1 liter of lukewarm water. This part is more important than most people realize. If the water is too hot, you'll silence the yeast before it ever wakes. If it's too cold, the cells simply stay asleep. What you want is warmth, about the temperature of your own hand, somewhere in that gentle 105 to 115 degrees Fahrenheit. Once the water is ready, add 2 tablespoons of dry baker's yeast, roughly 20 grams, and 1 teaspoon of sugar. Remember, the sugar is not a fertilizer. It is ignition fuel. It tells the yeast, wake up, multiply, begin your work. Stir the mixture until it dissolves completely. Then cover your container with a breathable cloth or a loosely resting lid. This protects the yeast from sunlight, but, and this is critical, you must never seal it airtight, because as the yeast begins to feast, it releases carbon dioxide gas. And if you trap that gas, pressure builds fast. A sealed container can swell, burst, or even pop with enough force to startle anyone nearby. So always allow your brew to breathe. Living things need air, and this tonic is no different. After 30 to 40 minutes, you should see a frothy cap forming on top, a layer of soft foam rising like a morning bread dough. That foam is the sign you've been waiting for. It is the breath of life. It means your microscopic workers are awake, active, and ready to serve your garden. But here comes the step that separates success from regret. You must dilute it.
Take your 1 liter of concentrated yeast brew and mix it with 10 liters of clean water. This 1 to 10 dilution ratio is not optional. The concentrate is powerful, too powerful for delicate young roots. Used directly, it can pull moisture from root tissues and cause a kind of osmotic shock. But diluted properly, it becomes nourishment, not stress. When your mixture is ready, water your plants at the base, right where the root zone lives. Tomatoes, cucumbers, beans, strawberries. These crops respond beautifully. Use the tonic once when the seedlings establish, once at flowering, and once again when fruit begins to set. And there is one last truth to remember. This brew is alive. It has no shelf life. You must use it within a few hours, or the spark fades and the magic slips away. Treat it gently, use it fresh, and let this living tonic remind you of something larger. That growth comes not from force, but from timing, care, and the right conditions meeting at exactly the right moment. When you're ready, let's continue, because the stories that follow will show you just how powerful this simple recipe can become. Part 5. Real stories and surprising facts. By now, my dear EverGreen seniors, you might be thinking the same question countless gardeners have whispered before.
Does this really work? And the truth is, the numbers speak louder than any promise I could ever make. In controlled greenhouse trials, plants treated with yeast water simple, living yeast water, showed root biomass increases reaching nearly 30%. Think about what that means underground. 30% more root mass is not a small boost. It is a larger stomach, a stronger foundation, and a wider reach into the hidden world of minerals and moisture. And it doesn't stop there. Some yield studies found fruit weights and spikelet counts rising by 20 to 28%. These aren't miracle claims. These are observations made when biology is allowed to do what biology does best. But let me share a story, one I think many of us can relate to.
There was a gardener named Joe tending to his late summer tomatoes, and they looked, well, finished. The leaves had yellowed, the stems drooped like tired shoulders, blossoms refused to open. It was the kind of plant you walk past and say, maybe next year. But instead of pulling them out, Joe decided to try the yeast brew. Nothing fancy, nothing expensive, just water, warmth, and a teaspoon of life. Within days, he began noticing thin white feeder roots pushing up near the soil surface, like the plant had suddenly remembered how to live again. By the end of the week, the stems had firmed. By the end of the month, those lost cause tomatoes carried enough fruit to fill a basket. 4 pounds of harvest. From plants he almost gave up on. And this, my friends, leads us into one of the most surprising truths of all. Yeast doesn't only help plants grow, it helps them defend themselves. Because yeast is a harmless fungus, it competes with more dangerous fungi, those that cause gray mold, blight, and rot. When you water with a living yeast brew, you fill the soil and leaf surface with friendly organisms that crowd out the enemies. You create a shield, biological instead of chemical, gentle instead of toxic. And as if that weren't enough, the presence of yeast can trigger what scientists call systemic resistance, meaning the plant begins strengthening its own immune responses, preparing its tissues to fight off diseases more quickly and more effectively. So when we talk about this simple kitchen ingredient, we are not talking about a fertilizer. We are talking about resilience, about revival, about a plant learning to grow stronger, faster, and wiser than it ever could alone. And this, my dear friends, is where the lessons from the garden begin to mirror the lessons of our own lives. But we will save that wisdom for the conclusion. Let's move forward. Conclusion. Lessons for the evergreen soul. As we come to the end of our time together today, my dear evergreen seniors, let us gently lift our eyes from the garden bed and look at the bigger picture beneath everything we've learned. Because this journey was never only about yeast or roots or biology. It was about a shift in the way we see life itself. We've talked about feeding the soil, not just the plant. And in that simple change of focus lies a profound truth. A plant only thrives when the invisible world beneath it is alive and nourished. And in the very same way, our own bodies, our energy, and even our joy are shaped by the quiet ecosystems within us. Just as trillions of microbes help a plant stand strong against drought and disease, our own microbiome shapes our immunity, our vitality, and the resilience we carry into every new season of our lives. When we choose natural biological paths instead of chemical quick fixes, whether in the garden or in our personal routines, we're honoring ancient wisdom. We're returning to the rhythm life has followed since the beginning of time. And perhaps the greatest lesson today came from Joe's tomatoes. Because how many of us have looked at something in our lives, a dream, a project, even a stage of our garden, and thought, it's too late, it's finished. Yet with just a little nourishment, a different perspective, and a living spark added back into the soil, what seemed lost can burst into life again. Gardening teaches us patience.
it teaches us humility. And it teaches us that even in the late seasons of the year and the late seasons of our lives, there is always potential waiting quietly beneath the surface, waiting for the right care, waiting for the right moment, waiting to explode back into color and purpose. We are, as the old song reminds us, billion-year-old carbon. We are part of this endless cycle of growth and renewal. And each day, choose what to feed our soil, our bodies, our minds, and our souls. So I leave you with one simple question. What nourishment will you choose today, knowing it will shape the harvest you gather tomorrow? Thank you, truly, for spending this time with me at EverGreen Seniors. If you try the yeast brew, come back and tell me what you see. New roots, new blossoms, new growth. Your stories always bring this community to life. And until we meet again, remember, keep your hands in the dirt, keep your heart in the garden, and may your days be filled with growth in every direction. Happy growing, my friends. EverGreen Seniors, wise, vital, and always, always growing.